G'day Poetry Geeks, I'm Jackson and you are watching The Poetry Show, and on today's Poetry Show, because it is the 11th of November, we are going to be looking at some of the poetry of Wilfred Owen. Okay, so I'm going to do something a bit different in this Poetry Show. It's going to be longer than previous ones, even though the previous ones go on for anywhere up to about 20 minutes each anyway. But what I'll do in the more information below this video, if you're watching it on the web, so where you click on, show more, there'll be some links to particular timestamps within the video. So if you're not feeling a particular poem or you just want to skip to the readings of particular poems, then you can use those links down below and they will take you to the different parts of the video. I'm planning on reading 4 Wilfred Owen poems and we'll see how we go. So the first one I'm going to read is Dulce et decorum est. Now this is an interesting poem because, well, I won't say anything yet. I'll just read it and then we can discuss it afterwards. Dulce et decorum est. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge. Till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, blood-shod. All went lame, all blind. Drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5-9s that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not say with such zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. I mean, this is probably Wilfred Owen's most famous poem. It's not accidental that I started with this one. Every time I read this, it really stops me in my tracks. I think it has to. There's so much horror in this poem. In fact, the poems of Wilfred Owen's that I've chosen today are particularly harrowing. I think one of the things that Wilfred Owen always tried to do was really capture the truth of war in poetry on the page. And I just think that that's such an impossible thing to do in many ways. You can't capture the real true horror of trench warfare and shell shock and gas and shelling and all of those things really in poetry. And yet Wilfred Owen, he does a bloody good job. This is a really harrowing poem. It's also beautiful in a poetic way, in the way that Owen uses meter and metaphor and the language that he uses. He gives it this poetic cadence. He elevates it to an art form, and it really is very well crafted art. So to have that as the representation of something that was experienced in warfare, I think is quite important and quite impressive, but also it stands as a really respectful, genuine monument to the men that died in the First World War. If you read over some of Wilfred Owen's letters, he talks about how he wanted to be a good officer and he wanted to lead his men well, but he also wanted to tell the truth in his poetry. He wanted to represent those men well in his poetry, and I think he does that wonderfully. The language in this, things like old beggars under sacks, you know, that beautiful description of the men to begin with, and we cursed through sludge. They don't even walk through the sludge of the mud. It's the walking itself is just, you know, peppered with their cursing and their muttering and their angst and heartache and pain and all of those things. It just comes through while they are, you know, marching through this horrible mud. And men marched asleep, you know, they're just this wonderful vivid imagery. But then you also got the horrors seep into it. Many had lost their boots but limped on bloodshod. So even though they're not wearing shoes, the blood on their feet has become their shoes. It's almost like it's become dried, caked on. The bleeding from their feet has become the shoes that they are wearing. The horrible description of a man floundering about in the gas. And also, there's an interesting part in this poem, towards the end, where it says, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues. As an interesting story, when I was, I taught this poem for Year 11 GCE English in the UK, probably about 10 years ago, it was 9 years ago. And in the anthology that we were reading, the line, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, had been cut. It just said bitter as the cud. The reference to cancer had been taken out of the anthology. And I wondered at the time, or I suspected at the time, that was because for a modern audience, cancer is a little bit of a trigger word. It's likely, incredibly likely, that 16-year-old students may know people with cancer, have lost loved ones to cancer. So the editors of this particular anthology for the exam board removed that half of a line, obscene as cancer, because it was deemed, I suspect, too much for the young reader or the modern reader. But if you read the rest of the poem, the whole thing should be cut. The whole thing is awful and dreadful and a horrid, really horrid reminder of what was going on. So they cut obscene as cancer, but they retained the blood comes gargling from froth-corrupted lungs. That imagery of inhaling this poison gas, your lungs on the inside start to froth and bubble and melt away and you cough them up. That was okay to keep. But obscene as cancer, that's too graphic. You know, and bloodshod. We can keep bloodshod, but we can't keep cancer. So I think that was a very interesting editing choice. And then, of course, we've got the old lie, Dulce, decorum est pro patria mori. I should have said this at the beginning, really. And this is a Latin inscription, which basically says how sweet and fitting it is to die for your country. So many men who enlisted in the war are signing up because they want to do their patriotic duty. And Wilfred Owen, just in that final 2 lines, says, that is a lie. It is not sweet and fitting to die like this for your country. It may be brave, it may be noble, but it's not sweet. It's not fitting. This is not the way men like this are supposed to die. And I think that's an incredibly powerful reminder of the responsibility of nations on their men and nowadays on their women when they call upon them to serve in the army, for it to be for the right reason and, you know, for it to honour them, I guess. So anyway, that was the first Wilfred Owen poem. They don't get any happier than this, I should warn you. Speaking briefly earlier of shell shock, I thought I would read this poem. This is, again, it's another harrowing one. This is called Mental Cases. Who are these? Why sit they here in twilight? Wherefore rock they, purgatorial shadows, drooping tongues from their jaws that slob their relish, baring teeth that leer like skulls, teeth wicked? Stroke on stroke of pain, but what slow panic gouged these chasms round their fretted sockets? Ever from their hair and through their hands' palms, misery swelters. Surely we have perished, sleeping, and walk hell. But who these hellish? These are men whose minds the dead have ravished. Memory fingers in their hair of murders, multitudinous murders they once witnessed. Wading sloughs of flesh these helpless wander, treading blood from lungs that had loved laughter. Always they must see these things and hear them. Batter of guns and shatter of flying muscles, carnage incomparable, and human squander rucked too thick for these men's extrication. Therefore still their eyeballs shrink tormented back into their brains, because on their sense sunlight seems a blood smear. Night comes blood black. Dawn breaks open like a wound that bleeds afresh. Thus their heads wear this hilarious, hideous, awful falseness of set smiling corpses. Yet their hands are plucking at each other, picking at the rope knots of their scourging, snatching after us who smote them, brother, pouring us who dealt them war and madness. Okay, so once again, I mean, there is when Wilfred Owen was in the war, he actually spent some time at Craiglockhart Hospital, which was a place where men were shipped when they were either injured and needed to recuperate, or they were suffering from shell shock. So when Wilfred Owen was writing this poem, he is very, very intimately aware of the men who have suffered from shell shock and the impact that it had upon them. You can imagine him lying awake at night in his bunk in the hospital and hearing the screaming and the terror of the men who get these flashbacks and for whom everything has been tainted. Everything, absolutely everything, reminds them of murder and pain and bombshells. There's this, I'd say lovely, but it's horrid, it's horrible, where he says, sunlight seems a blood smear. So when they see streams of sunlight, to them it's like a smear of blood through the atmosphere. That's the effect that the war has had on their mind. Night comes, blood black. So that the darkness that comes over them at night is not respite from the sunlight that has become blood. It is itself yet more blood. It's just, that is horrific. I remember a George Carlin bit where he talks about euphemism and the way that language over the years has been tweaked and neutered so that words do not carry the meaning that they once carried. And he uses shell shock as an example. He says, we used to call shell shock, and then we started, that was too punchy, so they changed it. It became this euphemistic language that we used to describe it, so it became battle fatigue. It sounds like you're tired rather than, shell shock. It was very clear what that was, but battle fatigue, it's almost like, it lessens the impact of the condition that it's describing. And then he says, and the modern era equivalent of that, we just add more and more syllables until it almost means nothing. He says the modern equivalent of shell shock and battle fatigue is post-traumatic stress disorder. And he talks about how that just completely robs what these men actually suffer of the truth of what they are experiencing. And I think, shell shock had that power, and Wilfred Owen's poetry has that power. I think it's sometimes easy for us who have not experienced it, for those who have not signed up for war, myself included, for those of us who have never actually suffered severe trauma that might lead us to PTSD, it might be hard for us to imagine exactly what that is and why the men and the women who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder are victims of that they are, as scary as we may find it as an outsider, they find it so much more scary, and that they need help, and that should be acknowledged. And I think one of the greatest ways we can honour that is firstly by helping them, but also by going back to Wilfred Owen and poems like Mental Cases and understanding that just the absolute horror that those sorts of experiences can have. So I won't go through that too much myself. I don't want to detract too much from Wilfred Owen's own writing, but that's, again, another very, very powerful poem. The next one is one I had never read before, but it's next to Mental Cases in the collection that I'm reading, so I'll read it to you. It's horrible, but it's, it is what it is. It's called The Last Laugh. "Oh, Jesus Christ, I'm hit," he said, and died. Whether he vainly cursed or prayed indeed, the bullets chirped, in vain, vain, vain. Machine guns chuckled, tut tut, tut tut, and the big gun guffawed. Another sighed, "Oh, mother, mother, dad," then smiled at nothing, childlike, being dead. And the lofty shrapnel cloud leisurely gestured, fall, and the splinters spat and tittered. "My love," one moaned. Love languid seemed his mood, till slowly lowered his whole face kissed the mud, and the bayonet's long teeth grinned. Rabbles of shells hooted and groaned, and the gas hissed. So again, this is a pretty self-explanatory one, but Owen here is in the opening two lines, the longer of the two lines. I'll just show you the layout of this one actually, because it's interesting. We have these two long lines opening each stanza, and then this kind of inserted 3 lines, and then 2 lines and inserted 3 lines. So what we have in the poem is the Owen quite faithfully, I think, recording the last words of men who have died in battle. Someone who cries out to God, someone who cries out to his mother and father, someone who cries out to his wife. And then we get the reply from the instruments of war. We get the response of the gas, the response of the bullets, the response of the shrapnel cloud and the bayonets, and the response to the dying words of each man is what Wilfred Owen refers to in the title of the poem, The Last Laugh. It's this kind of... I think Owen in preserving those last lines of that men spoke before they died is actually having the last laugh, if you like, by retaining that. But he reminds us that, these men are crying out in their last moments, but the only reply they get is not from their loved one telling them that they love them or that they will be missed, or that, but it's just the instruments of war surrounding them. I mean, it's heartbreaking. It really is. I don't mean to say that to be belittling. It really is quite heartbreaking. There is one more I wanted to read. Oh my gosh, this is heavy going. For those of you that are curious, the reason I'm doing this, if you're not aware of the reason why I'm doing this, the 11th of November is Armistice Day. At 11 a.m. on the 11th of the 11th, the First World War ended. It was called to a close. And you might think the 11th of the 11th at 11 a.m. What a coincidence! That's not a coincidence. They planned it to end. You know, they got together, the big wigs, the people who were sending men off to die, the lambs leading the lions, if you will, or the donkeys leading the lions, I should say. Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble finding this poem. And there we are. And so they decided, 11 o'clock on the 11th of the 11th, by golly, that's a good time to stop a war, isn't it? Tally-ho. But war doesn't start at midday. And the men in the trenches did not know this was coming. So how many men died on the 11th of November prior to 11 a.m. just so the people in charge could have a nice round number? I think that of all of the tragedies in the war is another that should not go unspoken and unrecognised. That somebody's bureaucratic decision to end the war at 11 a.m. because it was the 11th of November. How many men died from 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. and 10 a.m. until 11 a.m. I don't know the numbers, but if it's more than one, and of course it's more than one, then it's terrible. And the reason I chose to read specifically from Wilfred Owen, for one, I have a collection of his, which I just bought recently. Wilfred Owen died a week before the end of the war. He wrote all of these amazing, wonderful poems, and I think he is the last connection with the war that I really have. I don't really know anyone that was in the war, the First World War in particular. I don't connect much with other war poets. I've read a little bit of Robert Graves, I've read a little bit of Siegfried Sassoon, but Wilfred Owen is the one that really speaks to me. I don't know why. And yet, even though he is the monument to the war that is at least my kind of only engagement with it, he didn't live to see the end of it. He wrote all of these poems, and I'm incredibly grateful that they exist. And yet he never lived to see them published. He never lived to see them carry on the memory of the men that he was trying to honour. And I think there's a great tragedy in that. And yet Wilfred Owen, by his own admission, wanted to lead his men well. And he died trying to do that, trying to lead his men well. Towards the end of the war, he was trying to, I believe he was trying to recapture a bridge or something like that. And he died in that endeavour. And all that we are left with of Wilfred Owen is his poems. So that's why I wanted to stick with Wilfred Owen for today, for Remembrance Day, for Armistice Day. Okay, so this last poem is a sonnet. Sonnets, if you know, are usually for quite lofty remembrances. One of my previous videos, quite recently, was on Ozymandias, which was a sonnet. This great statue of Ramesses II. Many sonnets are about love. This sonnet is not about love, and is not necessarily about what you would normally consider to be something of the stature of Ozymandias, but I think in turning this into a sonnet, Wilfred Owen gives it that dignity and that honour and that place of honour. Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle, can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs, of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. So again, this is another poem which, similar to The Last Laugh, asks this question, if you like, of what songs will be sung for these heroes, what bells will be rung for them, what prayers will be said. And again, he uses the sounds from the machines of war and the actions of war. So there's no passing bells for these men who die as cattle. Only the monstrous anger of the guns. He uses really this. You can. The thing I love about Wilfred Owen is he really is kind of a poet's poet, in that he so masterfully uses language and the sounds of language. And this line, or this couple of lines, is an example of that. Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid tattle can patter out their hasty orisons. So the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter. You can just hear in that all of this consonance and alliteration, and also there's some assonance in there. Whenever you get this kind of really quick succession and really tightly packed and really dense use of alliteration, consonance and assonance, and by those terms I mean the repetition of particular vowel sounds and the repetition of particular consonant sounds. So the rattle, patter, sorry, I've forgotten them already. The stuttering rifles, rapid rattle can patter. You can hear in that, it's almost like a tongue twister. But what he's describing is rifle fire and machine gun fire. And in the way he's phrased these words, you can hear that pat 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 of gunfire. It's very artfully done and very well crafted. And I think Wilfred Owen asks the question almost, what will be the anthem for doomed youth? You know, what piece of art can adequately memorialise these men? And I think this poem is the answer to that question, because it's honest, it's musical, it's well crafted, it's everything that the gunfire and the wailing shells isn't. It's dignified, and I think it honours the sacrifice that these men made. So again, I think, you know, I wouldn't want to talk about the poem too much. I wouldn't want to unpack it too much. I wouldn't want to get too technical and English teachery about it, because really Owen deserves to be read simply for what he said and the way he said it, because he was a fantastic speaker of truth. His work became a wonderful monument to the men that died in war. So this video is really dedicated to the men who died in war, not for some kind of flag-waving, jingoistic, patriotic reason, not in that kind of, so-and-so died for our freedom, not in that sense, because I think that gets, we jump to that too often, and I think too quickly, without thinking through what it means. I only dedicate this video to those men because I have never experienced the pain and the horror that they have. I desperately and ardently pray to God that I never will. And yet they did, and whatever your politics, whatever your belief about patriotism, whatever side you are on, whatever side you were on, I think we can understand the humanity of others and the inhumanity of something as terrible as the First World War and many other things that have happened since. And I know that there are other tragedies in the world that deserve equal discussion. But really, given that it's the 11th of November, I just wanted to focus on that for today. So this video is really dedicated to the memory of people that have suffered in that way. So yeah, a very different poetry show, but that's all for today. If you stuck around for the whole show, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.